Hello, my name is Elena. I want to tell you a story about how one English class changed the way I learn. One day I asked my teacher a question. That question and the answer changed everything for me. It was a bright Tuesday morning. The classroom was filled with my classmates, each one ready for another day of learning. But that day felt different. I had a question in my mind that I could not ignore. It was about English and how to really learn it. I looked around. I could see Maria, who was trying to memorize vocabulary, and Javier, who seemed lost in thought. Then there was me, thinking about my question. Mr. Johnson walked into the room with a big smile, as always. "Good morning, class," he said cheerfully. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson," we all replied. The class began with some exercises. We repeated sentences, practiced some vocabulary, and listened to Mr. Johnson explain grammar. But my question kept repeating in my head. Finally, I raised my hand. "Yes, Elena." Mr. Johnson looked at me, his eyes full of curiosity. "Mr. Johnson," I started slowly, "how can I learn English correctly? I study a lot, but sometimes I feel like I'm not improving. I want to understand English, to speak it well." Mr. Johnson smiled as if he had been waiting for a question like this. "That is a wonderful question, Elena," he said, "and it's a question many students have. Let me tell you about some techniques that will help you." The room fell silent. All my classmates, even those who were usually distracted, looked up, ready to listen. "First," he said, "is reading, but not just any reading. Reading out loud. This way, you're not just seeing the words. You're also hearing yourself. When you hear yourself speak English, it becomes more real. You get used to the sound of English in your own voice." My notebook was open, and I quickly wrote down, "Read out loud." "But don't worry if you make mistakes," he continued. "Mistakes are a natural part of learning. Every mistake helps you learn." Then Mr. Johnson moved to the second technique, called shadowing. "Shadowing is very powerful," he said. "It means you listen to someone speaking English and try to repeat right after them, like a shadow. Imagine watching a video and following the speaker, repeating each sentence after they say it." One of my classmates, Javier, raised his hand. "Isn't that difficult?" "Yes, it can be," Mr. Johnson replied. "But it trains your ear and helps you learn the natural flow of English. It may feel strange at first, but with practice, it becomes easier." I imagine myself as a shadow, repeating after a speaker. It sounded like a challenge, but also exciting. Then Mr. Johnson introduced a technique that made everyone in the class laugh: mnemonics. "Mnemonics are tricks to help you remember things," he explained. "For example, if you want to remember the word butterfly, you can imagine butter flying around with wings. It sounds funny, but it makes the word stay in your mind." We all laughed at the thought of flying butter. I wrote down mnemonics in my notebook, and Maria, sitting beside me, whispered, "I'll definitely remember that." Mr. Johnson went on, "You can create your own funny images for new words. The stranger, the better. Your brain remembers unique images easily." After mnemonics, Mr. Johnson talked about read and write. He explained that reading in English was important, but writing was also essential. When you read, he said, you see how words fit together, but writing helps you remember those words and the way sentences are made. Try to write in English every day. You can keep a journal or write down things you see or hear. I thought about keeping a journal in English. Could I write about my day in English? It sounded like a challenge, but maybe I could try. Julia, another classmate, raised her hand. Mr. Johnson, can we copy English text to practice? Yes, Julia, he replied. Copying sentences or even paragraphs from English articles is very helpful. It shows you how to structure sentences, and you start to remember the way words fit together. He paused, looking at all of us, making sure we understood. Then he shared another idea. If you have someone who can read in English to you, you can write what they say. This combines listening and writing, 2 skills at once. I imagined asking my brother to read a paragraph while I wrote it down. It seemed like a good way to learn, so I made a note to try it. But Mr. Johnson wasn't finished. He looked around the room, making sure everyone was paying attention, and then he shared his final advice. Remember, he said, all these techniques are effective when you do them every day. Just like building a house, you need to add a brick each day. Consistency is key. Practice every day, even if it's only for a few minutes. I felt a wave of motivation. Small steps every day. I could do that. After the lesson, a few classmates stayed behind to ask more questions. I stayed too, listening as Maria asked about listening to English songs. Mr. Johnson said that songs are great because they help with pronunciation and rhythm. I decided I would listen to one English song each day and try to sing along. Javier asked if we could watch English movies. Mr. Johnson said yes, but to use subtitles in English, not our native language, and to pause and repeat the dialogues. It was all about practice, he explained. Movies, songs, books, everything in English helped. The next day I started trying these techniques. I read a small book out loud, feeling a little silly at first, but it got easier. I watched a short video, trying to shadow the speaker. It was hard, but I kept going. I wrote in my journal about my day, making simple sentences. Over the next few weeks, I noticed changes. I could understand more words when I watched TV, and speaking felt less difficult. One day, I even had a small conversation in English with a tourist in my town. I was nervous, but I remembered Mr. Johnson's advice. I tried. I made some mistakes, but it was okay. I was learning. One Friday after class, I thanked Mr. Johnson for his advice. Your techniques really work, Mr. Johnson, I said. He smiled, and with a warm look in his eyes, he said, You did the work, Elena. Just remember, learning a language is a journey. Keep going, and you'll keep improving. So, that is my story. If you are learning English too, remember, every day, small steps. Read, write, listen, and speak. And don't forget to have fun with it. English is not just a language to study. It's a door to a new world. Keep practicing and enjoy the journey.